Hey everyone, Tanner here again, and we are going to talk about select statements with aggregation. Now, if you're like me, the first time you hear the word aggregation, you wonder, well, what is aggregation? And I'm hoping that we help explain it just a little bit, but ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to take many rows and combine them into one. And I think it's going to make sense here in just a little bit. So, just like if you've watched the select statement video, which I hope you have, we selected first name and last name from contact. Just something like this, where we did, select uh, first name and last name from contact. And we get a list of 12 rows. Well, sometimes what we need to do is we need to perform some sort of mathematical equation. For example, if you had a bunch of uh, transactions, at the grocery store, they take every item that you purchase and they sum it to a total. We're going to do something similar, but we're actually going to take the count of last names here. We're going to see what the most popular last name is. Now, we can see this pretty easy from our simple 12 rows, but when you get bigger databases, sometimes it's not possible. So we're going to show a quick example of how to do aggregation. So just like with our select statement, we're going to start off with something pretty simple. So we're going to say, let's just select last name from contact, because we want to see what the most popular last name is. So let's start with our basic query here, where we get all of our last names. And when we have 12 rows, I'd like to note that we have 12 rows right now. But what we want to do is we want to get a count of the last names. So what we want our output to show essentially is the last name and how many of them there are. So let's get a count of last name. So we are going to do we're going to start with that same query, but we're going to add another column. And this is what makes an aggregate select statement, is some sort of function. And in this case, we're going to use the aggregate function count. And we want to get the count of last name. Now, if we try to run this, we will get an error. And it says not a single group function. And the reason being is because we are trying to perform an aggregate function on a result set without telling the computer how to group things. And it tells you the solution here. It says not a single group function. So what we need to do is we need to add the group by clause to our select statement. So we're going to add that, and you say group by, and then this is where you will specify how you want to group our records together. And I like to think of it how we're going to condense it, because you kind of have to tell it how you want to count your records. And so in this case, we want to condense or group our records by the last name, because we would basically want to take all the Win family and we want to group them together and count them and only return one row for Win. So we're going to group by last name. Now that we've fixed that, let's give that a shot again and see what happens. And here we can see we have all of our last names and then the counts. And so our Sweeney should have 3, Visquel should have 2, and our Win should have 2 there. So we can see that we're getting the proper counts. And you'll notice now we only get 8 rows selected. That's because we aggregated those 12 rows. We combined some of those records together into one, because, the Sweeneys, who used to have 3 records, now only have 3. We aggregated those rows, we shrunk it down and combined them with some sort of function. In this case, it was a count function, which is an aggregate function. And you'll notice that the group by clause is required when we have an aggregate function. Now there's one more thing we can add. Once we have an aggregate function and a group by clause, there is another clause of a select statement that becomes available to us, and that's the having clause. And the having clause lets us filter our aggregate function results. So normally in a select statement, we have our where clause right after the from clause. And we can't change that. So if we try to say, oh, we only want to see records where there's more than two people per or per last name, we have to use the having clause because we can't do it necessarily in the where clause. So we're going to say having a count of last name greater than 1. And let's see what we get here. And you'll notice now we only get the results that have a count of last name greater than 1. So we only get the multiple member families, or multiple last name, I should say. And so by aggregating and specifying how we have to have the grouping done by, because that's required when we have an aggregate function, it unlocks a new clause called having that lets us then filter those aggregate results. And just, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a messy title here. You'll see the count of last name. We could actually rename this with the as clause. So let's call that as total records. And let's give this a run. And now you'll notice that we have a new column name here because we said as total records. And that just makes it a little bit cleaner. That's aggregation in a nutshell. There's lots of different aggregate functions that you can look up and play with, like sum, to add, or many others. So make sure you check out some of those aggregate functions and play with them. Just know that whenever you have an aggregate function, a group by is required, and you can use the having clause to then filter those aggregate results.